Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today, I want to talk a little bit about domesticating animals. And animals are great for all kinds of things. I've titled this Getting Help because you'll see why later on. We think of animals mostly as grocery store things, and probably our relationship with animals that actually did start out that way. But not when it comes to domestication, and so we'll get to that in just a second. But first, let's go back to those adaptive strategies, right? How do you get food? We've talked about foraging, we've talked about agriculture. Today, we want to talk a little bit about pastoralism. And pastoralism starts in some places before agriculture, but definitely the idea of following herds, right, is something that is very ancient, and we'll come back to that in just a second. But first of all, when we talk about domestication, remember we're talking about taking specific plants and animals and incorporating them into our lives in such a way that we actually start changing their genetic makeup. We're doing things that change those organisms to be what we need as opposed to what they are in the wild. And remember, that was artificial selection through selective breeding. Okay, so when we talk about pastoralism, we know that herds transfer, right? And there is a seasonal migration of those herds. And herds can be used for all kinds of things. They can be used for milk, blood, meat, artifacts, right? Whatever. Typical herds are going to be goats, sheep, cattle, camels, yaks, right? That's pretty much most of it. Occasionally horses, so you can actually include horses in there a little bit. Now, traditional pastoralists are going to be found in North and Eastern Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Europe, all in places where agriculture is difficult or limited. And there are really two types of pastoralism. That's nomadism and transhumance. And nomadism is the oldest form of human community. And being a nomad actually predates being a herder, right? And so when we talk about nomads, we're talking about everybody moving along with the herd. Originally, this would start out as a wild herd. Perhaps you're following caribou or elk or deer or antelope, whatever you happen to be following. But over time, as we start domesticating animals, we start having our own herds. We have herds that we contain, and they can be fairly sizable. But they have to eat. And so as seasonal foods change, right, as the availability of foods change, the herds have to move. And so nomads move with their herds. Now, transhumance is part like kind of agricultural settlement and part herding group, right? Only part of the group is actually going to be that nomadic group. They're going to follow the herd, but then there are permanent settlements which act as home bases that are usually going to be inhabited by women and children. Oftentimes, if you're too old to follow the herd or too sick, you'll be in this permanent settlement. They do a little bit of cultivation, some hunting or some hunting gathering, more gathering than hunting, but they do some cultivation, so that's where the agriculture comes in. And oftentimes this is going to deal with an upper and lower latitude situation, especially in colder regions where you can only graze at those higher latitudes in the summer. You'd want to keep your permanent settlements where you're going to spend more time lower, where it's a little bit warmer. All right, so what's the pastoral personality? There have been a lot of statistical studies about people who herd versus people who farm. So basically ranchers versus farmers. And what they've come up with is that these statements, right? Farmers value hard work. Pastoralists do not, right? Well, one could argue that, in fact, many pastoralists do actually value hard work because it's hard to keep herds together. But what they mean by that is that farmers, the bulk of their day is going to be this keeping up with the crops. You've got to till the soil. You have to do other preparations to the soil, working in fertilizer, whether that is bone meal or compost or last year's residues, whatever. You have to develop irrigation systems. You have to plant the crops. You have to weed. You have to fight pests. You have to eventually harvest once you've done all of these things. Then once you harvest, you have to process and save for storage and preserve. That would be save for storage. So preserving and all of those things. Pastoralists really don't have a whole lot of that. So while they're not saying that pastoralists don't work, farmers, the value of a person becomes more about how hard and how well you work, is what they're saying. Okay, farmers consult each other and cooperate. Pastoralists work independently. This is true, right? Farmers have to have communities where they are working together. And these are barn raisings, and I think they are the perfect example of this whole cooperative situation. The entire community comes together to build a barn for a family, right? And then that family will go help build a barn for another family. And so it's this big community thing. You can rely on the people around you. You can trade with them. When you're in trouble, they'll help you. When they're in trouble, you'll help them. And so you have this close-knit community that is very willing to take care of each other. Pastoralists really don't have that, right? You have your herd. Somebody might try and steal your herd. You might try and steal someone else's herd. And so there's a little bit more conflict that goes on among more people than when you have farmers, for instance. Now, I'm not saying that farmers don't have interpersonal violence, but a lot of times it'll be community versus pastoralists who are small group versus small group, or individual versus individual. Now, on that flip side, okay, is that farmers tend to be more suspicious of outsiders and more hostile to outsiders. Even though they're extremely helpful to those in the community, there is a certain closed offness, whereas pastoralists don't have that. However, having said this, these three things are long-held anthropological beliefs about pastoralists versus farmers, right? But pastoralists, remember, have to protect their herd, and so they're pretty suspicious of strangers too. But they don't have that juxtaposition of being suspicious and a little bit hostile and extremely helpful, depending on who it is. All right, so modern pastoralists, when you look around the world, you're going to see they're in places where agriculture does not work out as well. Okay, and as a matter of fact, in one region on this list, animals were domesticated before crops. And where would that be? Well, I can tell you right up front, it's not the Fertile Crescent, right? The Fertile Crescent is called that because it has great agriculture. West Africa, you've got the ability to grow crops. I mean, that's where some of the crops we get today come from, coffee being one of those. China, well known for its early agriculture. They've been doing agriculture for at least 2,500 years on a massive scale. But remember, they are also one of the agricultural hearths for rice. And there is evidence that they've been farming for at least 12,000 years. Mesoamerica, no, not animals first, right? Corn, got a lot of corn. It's Northeast Africa, and think about Northeast Africa. What is it? It's a desert. You can't grow things very well in those conditions, and so they began as herders, not farmers. All right, so when we talk about domestication, let's just review. We are selecting for the desirable traits. It's controlled by breeding the individuals that we find to be the most desirable, and then we just continue breeding them until we get a species that ends up being dependent on humans. Okay? And we talk about animal domestication. It's a genetic change that makes the animal more amenable to human control. Okay? And so what this means is that we are breeding for animals that will get along with us. And you can consider an animal domestic when it is kept for a specific purpose, when we control their breeding, when the bulk of their survival depends on us, and they have traits that are not found in the wild. Okay? This is not the same as taming, training, or captive breeding. All of those things we also do. Domestication is much more complicated and takes a lot longer period of time because you're doing a lot of breeding. So now I just want to talk about some of the animals that we've domesticated and what their origins are. The domesticated sheep, super duper cute, right here. We've been having sheep for around 11 to 15,000 years, and that's in Southeast Europe, Central and Southwest Asia. Their progenitor is the mouflon, which is, well, these are wild sheep, but is this guy right here. And they would not actually survive in the wild, sheep, and so this is one of the things that makes them domesticated, because they have this very thick, woolly coat year-round. And so when it gets hot, they would actually overheat and die, and that would be sad. Right, goats, right? This is the progenitor of the goat, Capra agagris. I always have a hard time with that. Capra agagris. And they're about 8,000 to 9,000 years old. They're Asian, okay? Now, the fun thing about goats, unlike sheep, is really, if you look at this guy, there's not a whole lot difference between this one and that one, except those gigantic horns. They can easily revert back to the wild type. So they are domesticated because they do have traits that we like. They are dependent on us, and we do raise them for a specific purpose, but they are still, the traits that they have that we like don't make them unable to survive in the wild. Okay, pigs. We know a lot about domestic pigs. There's domestic pig right there. They're only about 5,000 to 9,000 years old. They come from the Middle East. They are interesting because they're really difficult to move over long distances. You can't herd them around. Their progenitor is the Eurasian wild boar, that is known for its aggressiveness and frankly its violence and its destructiveness. Interestingly enough, they actually do revert back to the wild type really, really easily within like 1 or 2 generations. And that has become such a problem in the U.S. There's probably around 6 million feral hogs, which are a mix of the Eurasian wild boar and then this specialized Russian wild boar, and so they're really, really dangerous, actually. But anyway, they're a terrible invasive species that cause billions of dollars worth of damage every year. Okay, so now we want to talk about the cow, and we have lots of cows. There's about 3 billion cows on the planet, almost half of the human population, and none of them fit into a wild ecosystem. So where did they come from? Well, this is a Scottish Highland cow. It's a bull, actually, and they look very much like, in appearance, the auroch, which is the progenitor of the cow. Okay. Now, cows are interesting because we don't really know how they got to be domesticated. We don't know how they got to be domesticated. But there's definitely chemical evidence for dairying in a couple of different cultures. Around 10 to 15,000 years ago, we've got them in Europe, right, and Asia. And Britain actually has a long history of dairying, okay? And we know this because we found residues of dairy fats on pottery. Now, here's the thing about cows. They're more docile, they have regular milk production, they're meatier, and they have fattier meat, which is what makes it so tender and delicious if you like red meat. But the problem with this whole situation is that cows are really, really aggressive, and aurochs especially, and they were huge, by the way. They could stand up to 6 feet high at the shoulder, and that's 2 feet taller than most modern bovines. This guy's pretty close to that size, but is still smaller than the auroch. Okay, and these guys are definitely not 6 feet tall. And so this is, if you add a foot onto that, you're getting closer to the auroch. Okay, they became extinct in Poland in 1627. The last of the aurochs lived there, and of course we hunted them all. Okay, and again, we don't really know how we domesticated these guys. It's very difficult. Bulls, highly aggressive. Now, horses. We love our horses, and horses actually fill lots of functions. Probably more jobs are done for us by horses than any other animal. And actually, they only date back to about 5,000 years ago. They were domesticated in Mongolia and Siberia. They come from this guy right here, who's a tarpan. And we see the tarpan, we've seen them in the Grasslands video about Mongolia. These are the horses you were looking at. The interesting thing about these is they can take a bit in their mouth because of the way their teeth are shaped, right? They don't actually have teeth towards the back of their mouths, and so you can put that in there, and a bit can control the horse really well, and so you can make smaller, more subtle movements with them, and so they end up replacing cattle and oxen as work animals, and frankly they can be a whole lot friendlier, and you can ride them, and they're fast, so win-win-win. Alright, and then what about poultry? Chickens and turkeys. We also do duck and geese, but I'm only going to talk about chickens and turkeys. Chickens come from the red jungle fowl, and really, they don't look a whole lot different, except these guys are fat and delicious, because they have much larger breasts because we like to eat that. They also produce larger eggs because we like to eat those as well. And then here, of course, is a wild turkey, and here is a domestic turkey. These are from Mexico and what is now the United States. And of course, we do the same thing. They have much larger breasts. These guys fly really well. These guys do not fly really well. Okay, so here are just some of the domestication centers, so you can kind of get an idea of where all these things are coming from. Now, which of the following is not evidence for animal domestication? The presence of an animal species outside its natural range, an abrupt population increase of some species relative to others, morphological changes in animal populations, or remains of animals of different ages and sexes at a site. Well, animals migrate and range. Sometimes they do that outside of their natural range, so that's kind of a normal thing that doesn't have anything to do with domestication. Even though you will find animal species outside their natural range because of domestication, it's not evidence of it. An abrupt population increase or decrease, that could have to do with resources, right? Some animals go extinct, some animals boom. It depends. You know, what if you have rains in a desert and all of a sudden you've got grass? Well, you're going to have a whole ton of camels, you know. We have domesticated camels, by the way. Morphological changes in animal populations, we know that's one of the definitions of domestication. But what about remains of animals of different ages and sexes at a site? Well, that's great, but it doesn't mean you domesticated it. It just means that they were dead there at some point. And so that could be coincidence. It could be due to hunting, right? You never know. So the answer was 4. Okay. So, what about wild animals? We do actually still use wild animals. They can be caught and trained, but they are not domesticated. And so you see these guys right here. These are caribou. Actually, they're reindeer because they're in Asia, but it's not important. So they're these lovely reindeer. They make great pack animals, so you can ride them around. They're not domesticated. They're still wild. They're just trained, okay, tamed and trained. This is a beautiful eagle, right? And this is a Mongolian hunter, and they've captured these, they've trained them, they've tamed them, but they're not domesticated. So why would we do this? Why would we go to all this trouble? Well, food is a really good reason, okay? First of all, they make milk, right? Milk and milk products. Yeah, so goats use cattle, mare, sows, llama, camels, reindeer, right? Yaks all provide milk. Milk is more important to us starting out than meat is, because a milk animal will last a lot longer. You get the protein, you get the fat, you get the good nutrition, okay? Now, we also like them for meat. Sheep and goat around the world are eaten by more people than any other meat, okay? Now, cow is eaten in much larger quantities than any other meat. Although there are some religions that have restrictions on cows and pigs, beef and pork consumption. Hindus don't eat beef, and Muslim, Hindu, and Orthodox Jews do not eat pork. And that has a lot to do with parasites and things like that you find in that. And then many people outside of the United States and Greece actually do eat horse meat. Oops, went too far, sorry. Okay, and then of course we get wool, hair, hides, which we turn into leather, and pelts, which is fur, commonly used for clothing. I mean, that's where we get our clothing for the bulk of the time that we've actually been involved with hunting animals. And then today, more than 100 countries, you have fibers, hair and wool, from ruminants, so that would be cattle, sheep, all those guys, that are used in the manufacture of clothing, bedding, housing, and carpets. Yeah. All right, and then shelter. Those same hides provide great materials for tents and roofs, and hair will hold plaster together and makes it stronger. Okay. Bones and hides are used for tools, and then utensils. You can make sacks out of bladders. You can make other tools out of horns, and then catgut, intestine, right, can be used to make twine and rope type stuff, and really helpful. And then also you can just have them for decoration, right? Jewelry, various bits of bone or horn or something like that. And then also perfume. I mean, think muskox. If you have a perfume or a cologne that's got musk in it, it came from a muskox. All right, and then of course working. The most important thing that we've done, and probably one of the earliest things, milk and work. That's what we originally domesticated animals for, okay? And so we do packing, transporting, right? We've used them as military vehicles. We've done all kinds of things with them. And in fact, India actually has 200 million cattle, right, and buffalo. But they don't eat them. They're entirely used for work. Oh, and they also use elephants for work too, which is kind of cool. But anyway. Okay, so here's a question. Cats. What about cats? Why are cats domesticated? They represented an Egyptian goddess and had to be kept in temples. People are masochists at heart because cats are demons. They control rats in grain stores, or they're a good, quick source of protein. Well, I'll tell you right now, most people do not eat cats. They're not really a thing. And I actually have a cat, so I like cats. So number 2 is a joke, because lots of people don't like cats. And then they do actually represent an Egyptian goddess, Bast. And they were kept in temples, but they were already domesticated. Mostly, they were domesticated to eat rats to protect grain. So even cats, who mostly lay around your house currently, were useful. Think barn cat. All right, so just culture and society, we've got all kinds of things. War, transportation, and power. Religion, we worship animals, right? Lots of cultures worship animals, or in every culture, the deity is, or the deities, each are represented by some animal, okay? And that ranges from Christianity to Hinduism to folk religions. The gods are represented by animals. Then recreation, right? Horseback riding, that's pretty fun. Yeah, things like that. And then health. Right now, we use laboratory animals. We actually use laboratory animals a lot. Not as much as we used to. And there are strict rules and regulations about the comfort and the humane treatment of those animals. But we still do that. And then we also use their products and byproducts in pharmaceuticals. Okay, so how did this happen? Well, basically, we end up wanting milk, right? Animals are most often valued for their milk, as we talked about earlier. Now, the interesting thing is that mammals lose their ability to drink milk as they grow up to adults. However, modern humans, most of them, are lactose tolerant, okay? And that's a very interesting thing. So it's expected that baby is going to nurse, typically from a mother, although nowadays we have formula and things like that that can help out, just in case that's not working out. And so that's wonderful. But the point is that they're drinking some sort of milk, right? Mostly it's human milk or some sort of facsimile of human milk. But then as we get a little bit older, we can switch and drink other animals' milk. And we can do it throughout our entire lives. This is very different than any other mammal, okay? And so for those of you that are feeding milk and cream to your cat, some of them can handle it, right? Mostly because they've gotten used to it. But for most of them, it makes them a little bit sick. Even though they like it right up front, it doesn't make them feel great later on, and sometimes it makes them throw up. Okay, so how does this happen? Mutations occur independently in 4 different cultures. Europe, 8,000 years ago. The funnel beaker, the other 3 in Africa. So the funnel beaker culture, 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. The Bantu, 4,000 years ago. And remember, we talked about them when we talked about language, because they were important for that. In Kenya, about 2,700 years ago. And this is really important. It's a very advantageous mutation, okay? And it's found in, these are all dairying cultures, okay? So it turns out that the ability to drink milk and eat milk products made those individuals healthier, right? Makes children healthier. And all of the people who have, so you start out with a mutation, they're pretty successful. Their kids have it. They're pretty successful. And all of a sudden, in a very short period of time, the majority of people ever, right, are lactose tolerant. It carries with it several other genes, and so you'll find that the lactose gene comes with a bunch of other genes. When this happens, it's called a genetic sweep. So you have one gene that is so amazing, it just takes over the population, and then all of the other genes that go with it, that are carried with it, whether they're related or not, also end up being more prevalent too. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. You're going to do a lab about lactose tolerance. Okay, so cooking. One of the things that really helped us become very successful was the ability to cook. We can cook because we can eat more types of foods. Cooking detoxifies lots of plants, like everybody in the potato family. This is actually the cassava family. Cassava and all of its friends, yams, potatoes, taro, all of those, they are actually toxic, and some are more toxic than others. They have to be cooked, okay? There's more benefit because you can get more nutrition from the food. It increases digestibility. It's pre-digestion, so we don't have to work as hard to get stuff out of it, right? Which is great. And it can kill lots of microbes, and so it's going to decrease the pathogens that you find when you've got stuff just hanging out. And there's a really interesting hypothesis that relates cooking to decrease in jaw size, right? Smaller teeth, and an increase in the hominid brain, because we have so much more nutrition. This is about 1.8 million years ago. We have so much more nutrition. We have much more protein. Okay, we're getting much more energy from our food, and we don't have to chew it as much. And so a series of mutations that all occur at the same time, and some variety that you have just because of, reproduction and the recombination things that go with that, we all of a sudden have this very quick increase in cranial size, decrease in jaw and teeth size, and probably has a lot to do with cooking, okay? And there's a lot of archaeological evidence for that. You can go to most sites that you find, and we've seen that cooking actually starts at least 500,000 years ago. All right, so what about spices, though? One of the things that you find out about plants is they have a lot of defenses against herbivory, right? They don't like to get eaten. It's not fun for them. So they produce all sorts of toxins, yeah? Capsaicin, for instance, in jalapenos that we're really familiar with here, would be one of them. Those are spicy, so things don't eat them. We are okay with it. We like it. But why? Why would we want to have spice to begin with, okay? So first of all, who uses the most spice out of the following groups? People in the Arctic tundra, tropical rainforests, temperate grasslands, or boreal forests? Well, if you think about spicy food, you're going to think about places near the equator. I want you to think about what is different about equatorial regions than other regions, right? And for this, you are going to design and execute your own lab to test and to explain why you find spicier foods in equatorial regions than you find anywhere else. Okay, so that is it for this conversation, and we'll talk about your assignment more in class. But if you have any questions, let me know, and thanks for listening.